integration, and we are the home or the anchor point, however you want to see it, for this wonderful initiative. And I'm so delighted to, which I'll do shortly, introduce all of our speakers. What I would ask, just as we're getting going and you're getting settled and maybe finding a cup of coffee, we could almost imagine as if we were all walking into a real room together, and I hope at some point we will. So there may be some people talking in the corner. There's somebody like me who's got laptops and papers, and someone comes to sit beside you, you move your things off of one chair. So just as we're coming in, and Nadine is also popping a message into the chat, do feel free to let us know where you're calling in from. We would be happy to hear where you are, and maybe you can sort of add anything you'd like on what you're bringing into the space this morning. So welcome again, and panelists, colleagues, I would invite you to do the same.
Hello, how are you? Good morning. Hope you can hear me.
Good morning, Hal-Young. Perfect. We have opened up the space. Our colleagues, the participants you'll see are in the room, and we were just going to give everyone one more minute before we get started. Thank you, Hal-Young, and welcome.
Sure. So, good morning, Otto. How are you?
Good morning, Hal-Young. Good to see you. I'm very well, thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Mariam, hi, I can see you.
Hi, Hal-Young. Good to see you again.
Yeah. And the other colleagues.
Colleagues, I suggest we get started. Panelists and participants, if that's okay with you, we only have an hour. I think we all know how quickly this goes. So I've shared one word of welcome, and let me continue to do so for the colleagues who are still coming into the room. My name is Laurel Patterson. I lead our team in SDG integration under the directorship of Hal-Young, who is also joining us and will be providing opening remarks. If I ask Nicole if we can just change to the agenda, I feel like it's always good to give you a sense of what we'd like to do, what we'd like to cover in the next hour with you. We'll have some opening remarks. There will be a panel on the Action Learning Lab. We'll be sharing experiences, and particularly the Learning Insights, which has also been a fantastic initiative that's run alongside the lab itself. So we'll be sharing with you what we've learned from the perspective of participants, from the perspective of their experiences. And we also have one of our colleagues from the lab joining us today. We'll provide some closing remarks, and in doing so, we hope to be able to set the direction of how we want to take this work forward in the future. So to say two quick points as opening up to set the stage for Hal-Young, what I would want to add is that one of the real motivations for this particular initiative was our interior condition as development practitioners. And it came in the midst of the disruption of COVID, where we really felt a disconnect fundamentally. No, and I think in so many ways, COVID was a wake-up call for many. And we asked ourselves in that moment, what does this moment require of us? What can we contribute into it? And if we are truly going to seize this as a moment of change, a moment of radical departure from the past, that's going to require something of us. And it won't be doing more of the same. It won't be doing it faster. It will be really rethinking our operating systems, our operating mindsets. And so one of the quotes that really guided us through a lot of our work is that the success of any intervention is entirely based on the interior condition of the intervener. So the success of an intervention is based on the interior condition of the intervener. And we really have taken that spirit and line of inquiry throughout the work that we've done to say, what are we bringing into this space Can we situate and understand ourselves in systems? And from that place, can we move forward to build the leadership that's required of us in the decade of action? So with that, I will hand over to Haliang to provide the opening remarks for this session. Haliang, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. I think it's an excellent quote, to start with. It is really true. I would say it's really our capacity to adapt to change that will make a difference in the decade of action, ahead of us. And today we have a unique event, and we have 8 UN agencies, working together in a really interesting experiment of learning and building systems, change capacity. For the UNDP, UNHCR, UN Women, EMD, UNCDF, UNEP, DPPA, and FAO. So I think it's really exciting that I personally joined this and to see what we've done. I think we all know why we're doing this. I think really in a few words, we're in a really challenging environment with COVID, with a significantly lagging, SDGs. And in this week of high-level political forum, we in fact, learned, how much we're behind, the several important targets, despite, all efforts. Just one event I attended, we still have nearly 800 million people do not have access to energy, to electricity practically, and so forth. So I think we have a challenge. So how do we deal with these challenges, right? Unless we also realize that unless we take a systems approach to really achieve, to try to get some transformational change, the business as usual approach will not be enough. But to achieve that kind of change, we needed to really build new skills and a cultural shift, on how we see ourselves, how we see our work, and how we see, we collaborate. So this is when we started, with Otto, right? In a conversation was about a year ago, and then it was a few conversation with a few colleagues, and then it developed into really a global dialogue across the organization in UNDP. But then we also worked across, with a few agencies to continue that dialogue, and that dialogue really caught up, with the, I don't know what to say, the imaginations of a lot of colleagues. So I think so with Otto and the Presence Institute, we developed this, 4-month action learning lab, and into this partnership across agencies to really focus on building this capacity that we need to deal with complexities, uncertainties, the transformational changes we need to achieve. So, I also know that we have worked with a team of learning specialists from Parsons School of Design and the New School to look at the learning accomplishments that we have done. And so I'm really excited to see what this event will tell us. And we have really quite a few colleagues now. I see, I don't know how many, 160 colleagues, from across the system, across the globe joining us. So I'm really looking forward to the discussions in this 1 hour. So without further ado, Laura, I give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Haliang, thank you so much. Let me move to our panel. We're going to have a brief reflection on the insights with Mariam Karkar from UNHCR, one of our key partners, and also a real champion of awareness-based systems change, and really thinking through how we build leadership capabilities to respond to 21st century challenges, together with Otto, who has led the Action Learning Lab, a long-standing partner of ours. And I'm delighted to hear from you both. I'm going to come in at the end with a couple of thoughts. I'm dual-hatted in this part of our event, as I often am. Otto, let me start with you first. If you could please share with us what resonated for you in terms of the feedback from participants, and what does that tell you about where we need to move in terms of building this work in the future?
Thank you so much, Laurel, and for your framing remarks. So I would like to share 4 observations from my end that stood out kind of from my angle. But before doing that, I would like to really double click on a few things you both just said and go back to the framing. What is it really we are trying to do here with one more elaboration? And I will show one picture around that. Laurel, you mentioned the term we need to rethink our operating systems, and doing it from a systems perspective, I think really breaks down to 4 operating systems that we see institutions evolving through. And that I would like to use as a lens here. And 1.0 really is kind of the traditional ways of doing things, right? So input authority centric. And in terms of management, it's really management by authority, by command and control, essentially. So that's still in place to some degree. But of course, we have this what's called operating system 2, output and efficiency centric. Basically, that's kind of management by objectives is an example here, and basically organizing and getting things done by driving efficiency metrics. And that's, of course, the KPIs, kind of that's we all know. And the second language of here. But as everyone knows, and anyone I have really worked with in the UN system, when you ask them, those 2 things are not enough, because most of you are in a situation that's referred to as leadership challenge, which means that in order to get the job done that you want to get done, you need to influence others and help others to making it happen. Other stakeholders that are not in your sphere of influence or control. So that's the network leadership challenge, and it kind of comes with a new set of skills there. And then, of course, the 4.0 is not just outcome and user-centric, but co-creative and ecosystem-centric. And basically, if we look at the SDGs, if we look at 2030 agenda, if we look at the situation you just described, Hao-Liang, including kind of the climate challenges we face, what we need to do is really bringing all the key stakeholders together and helping them to move their mindset from a silo to a systems view, or as I like to say, from an ego to an ecosystem perspective, and activating awareness-based collective action. So that's kind of the transformative leadership that in many ways are. Now, I have, these distinctions of these 4 operating systems, I have shared that in a number of places, including in the UN and the Action Learning Lab, but also in other occasions. And the consistent response, and then I ask, okay, where's the UN system at? And here is kind of the response kind of I have been getting. We are trying to create 4.0 results with 1.0 and 2.0 structures. So that's, that's a recent quote, but that's kind of the shortest summary I could give. So we are trying to create results kind of around the SDGs, around the climate action, by often being limited to ways of operating that are steeped in 1.0 and 2.0 mindsets and ways of operating. And what we need to learn, therefore, is to develop these deeper ways of listening, of conversing, and of leading. And so that focus here, developing empathic and generative listening, developing the capacity to engage in stakeholders with dialogue and collective creativity, that is pretty much what we try to do. That's kind of the design. That's kind of the investment. That's kind of the experiment. And so on that backdrop, so the 4 observations that I are the following. So the first one is that we have significant degrees the building of these new leadership capacities, empathic and generative listening, dialogue and collective creativity, and developing the capacity for holding the space for these co-creative multilateral or multi-stakeholder relationships. So yes, there has been that progress, to some significant degree. The second observation from my end is moving from self-doubt to action confidence. And that, to me personally, was a little bit of a surprise. When you look at the UN system from the outside, right, it's such a powerful organization and so on and so forth. If you talk to the change makers there, you wouldn't expect the level of self-doubt and insecurity. And I thought that was interesting. Also, how many people kind of talked about, tapping, so moving beyond self-doubt. As one Pacific Island participant put it, on a whole systems level, she said, size doesn't matter. When you bring together the whole system in a diverse group, what matters is recognition of patterns and activation of different social patterns or fields. So that was kind of that level of empowerment we have seen. And the other issue related to moving from self-doubt to action confidence has to do with realizing that the locus of agency does not start out there with other people and other structures, but it begins in here with attending to my own experiences and relationships differently. So that's kind of the interior condition that Laura was talking about, and that so many of the participants commented on. 3, group composition. The strongest participant group came from Africa, and then Asia and South America in that order, particularly from countries and teams who operate in fragile situations and or weak infrastructures, and who were previously thought to be less likely to take advantage of an offering like this. And the fourth observation, of course, is that all of that happened in a once-in-a-century pandemic. Many people feeling overwhelmed and exhausted by the current situation, and then experiencing the Action Learning Lab as a source of regeneration that allowed them to form connections across agencies, many people commented on, and to realize that many of their personal experiences are not private, but systemic phenomena that show up in many of their colleagues' experiences too. So in other words, kind of this, and this shift, it's from the outside, right? It looks like nothing. But from my perspective, moving from level 1 and 2 to level 3 and 4, that's the most important shift of all, because it's the seeds of building level 3 and 4 capacity. And then lastly, in closing, since many of us, I suspect, right, are here in the role of actually building these infrastructures, building these deep and transformative learning infrastructures. So what have we learned? What does it take? And what I and my colleagues have been learning over the past months and really over the past 2 decades is what it takes to build these transformative learning infrastructures are 4 structural components. Number 1, tools, like listening or the 3D tool. Number 2, practice fields. So where safe environment, where these new behaviors can be practiced and developed in a safe space. Number 3, arenas of activation and resonance, by which I mean creating conditions that allow people to reconnect with their own purpose, with the institutional purpose, the UN purpose, and to experience the resonance among them across the entire community. So that's when Hao Liang, when you said, so the dialogues caught up with the imagination of lots of people. That's exactly this activation, right? So we did the activation of this higher purpose, or of this imagination, as you put it, particularly in the dialogue sessions, but also in the workshop sessions in the Action Learning Lab. And then the last, so that's component number 3. And I think the last structural component for transformative change infrastructures is an ongoing support structure, including the buy-in from top leadership, to situate these support structures in the context of the 2030 agenda, SDGs. And that's what, in our case, Achim provided, you provided, Hao-Liang, and other leaders from other agencies. But that going forward is something that we need to specify in the context of all the different agencies involved. And on that note, I hand it back to you, Laurel, for the further discussion.
Otto, thank you. I mean, so many insights that I'm sure Miriam will pick up in different ways and contribute herself. And then I think when we take a look at the insights, as well as some of what we're seeing as leverage points, just these centers of gravity where we find a lot of colleagues centering on certain reflections from the lab. Many of these points will be echoed again, Otto. So thank you so much. And for helping us create a brave and very different space for colleagues to interact and learn. And Miriam, let me at this point invite you to come in, please.
Thanks, Laurel. And it's so good to be here. And I remember when we had this first conversation about a year and a half ago, and to see where that conversation has brought us to something extraordinary that you and all our colleagues at UNDP created with the Presencing Institute is remarkable. I don't think when we had that first discussion, we could have ever imagined an interagency space, an innovative opportunity, and actually an opportunity to sustain it and take it to the next level. So congratulations to all of you under Hao-Liang's leadership to get us here. My observations are actually coming from two different hats. It's coming from someone who's been in the UN system for 17 years and someone who's worked across the system in different organizations. And one observation and takeaway that I had right away was what an interesting opportunity to bring people from all the different agencies together, but it also highlighted the gap that each one of us comes into our respective agencies with a very siloed approach, because I've just recently joined UNHCR and I'm coming into UNHCR with a very siloed approach. And, you know, this is our mandate. This is how we work. I am part of the UN community, but you end up getting absorbed into a part of a UN system and you don't have time to think about how you fit in the bigger system. In the 17 years that I've moved across the system, I've never had an orientation from any agency that actually sat me down and said, this is how you belong and this is how you are part of the UN community. And to me, this dialogue highlighted I looked at some of the comments that, wow, we have been in the system for how many years and we don't have a way to bring people into the UN irrespective of what agency they join. We do it at a very superficial level, which shows us an organogram and how your fund or program fits in. So you tell me, we are here bringing people across different agencies together for the first time in this space, and yet we've missed one key step before, is to orient them to think you are part of the UN family and this is how you belong. That's one takeaway. The second takeaway, which is that I applaud the work we are doing in this space. I applaud the call for action that we have from our senior leaders, all things that will move us in the right direction. All things that have been done before across the system. The gap in this case is you can get leadership support, you can get people to join programs, you can get an opportunity for people to grow and learn. But when the rest of the system doesn't reward or enable that kind of a change, it's not going to go anywhere. By the rest of the system, I mean, when you are hiring new leaders, are you using those old competency frameworks where you're looking at past leadership behaviors that we thought actually mattered? Performance management, when you're looking at developing leaders, when you are looking at rewarding, all of that, if that doesn't change, if the other parts of the system doesn't change, what this does is start a dialogue, but it's not going to make the impact that we want it to make. So that was one of the takeaways. The third comes from this idea of the change maker, and Otto brought that up. What's very interesting is many of our leaders, whether it's the reps in UNDP, reps in UNHCR, they're all change agents. They're all building business transformations or new changes. And Yet the leadership competencies, if you look at them in detail, what you're rewarded for is not necessarily bringing other people along, showing your vulnerability, asking for help. You're held accountable for what you delivered, not how you delivered it and how you got there. And again, very superficial level. If some of you get a chance, and I'll send it to Nicole, the CEB and the Future of Work committee met a couple of months ago, and there was an action plan from all leaders in the UN system, and there's 5 action plans, and 2 resonate with the work that I think we're doing here. One of the actions was all the leaders in the UN system, including the Secretary General, have committed to creating a culture of continuous learning and growth. Now, it doesn't mean a culture of more learning programs, but it means creating an ecosystem that allows growth and learning to happen. The second, and this links to what Otto was saying about vulnerability and people not sharing, it's leaders building a culture of trust. And I think that trust and vulnerability are linked, but we haven't yet made the link in the system. And then the last point I'm going to make, and this might be a little bit controversial, so please, it's my last point, the issue of when people were asking for more tools. And this is where I actually, I say, when you look at the work we've done in the labs, we've given you tools, but the tools are not going to work if you don't actually internalize them and create your own toolkit. I think we need to stop in the UN wishing for people like MIT or Harvard or INSEAD to give us tools as leaders to use. I think we can get some tools and frameworks, but it is up to us as leaders to create them for ourselves and own them. So Laurel, those were my insights, and thank you for letting me share those insights with all of you.
Miriam, thank you. It's fantastic, and I could see that it resonated with a lot of people in the room. So thank you very much for that. I want to pick up and connect a couple of them before we move into looking at the learning learning insights in more in depth. And the first thing that I would say is, it is true. We have heard a lot from practitioners about, I would almost call it like a yes, but, or a yes, and. So yes, I feel safe in this space. It's an opportunity to grow. I'm rethinking myself and my own positionality and systems. How do I take this to the next level in my operating environment? And 2 points come up in that respect. The one is that colleagues are often, because we work in the UN system in fairly strong verticalities in terms of leadership, people are often looking for permission. Can I really do this? Would it really be possible for me? And so on. So that is something that we need to think a little bit more about. But also it comes back to colleagues to say, how do I do this in a way that is authentic to my lived experience? So really understanding that systems is not only an expertise, Miriam, as you said, it's a lived experience. It's part of what we are bringing of ourselves into our work environment. So that's quite foreign for a lot of our colleagues who are waiting for a tool, as you've said. I'm waiting for the 5 steps. I'm going to apply the 5 steps. But you are the 5 steps. They don't exist anywhere else except with you. So how can we build spaces like this that do a couple of things? One, give the opportunity for colleagues to find their agency, also as Otto had said, but also how do we build out from here towards the collective? So one of the things that we did in the global dialogues is we led the inquiry through the elements of theory U with Otto alongside an inquiry into our HDR, human development in the Anthropocene. And one of the big findings from there was around social norms and the fact that the biggest indicator of your behavior is the people closest around you. And Miriam, you're echoing this as well too. If all colleagues, if all of us operate in a different way, for those that are coming through this lab, it can also be quite disorienting. I feel a certain way here, but I need to look and act differently out there, right? So part of the challenge for us is to say, how do we connect this with a collective action, an awareness-based collective movement, so that more colleagues are drawn towards a different kind of leadership capabilities and application systems. So that's a question. There's no answer there. But this is really part of what we want to lean into. We know that one lab, 4 months is a contribution, but what is this continuation and how do we create the collective, I think is really important for us, for Haliang, and for many others, at least in the conversations we've had on UNDP. You see this through our strategic plan. how do we translate is the question of the how. What is that translation into action? So thank you both so much. I'm going to hand over to Nicole, to Julia, to Sudipti, and to Lucas. One of the things we've intentionally done here, colleagues, that I think sometimes we forget about when we're working on initiatives like this is, what are we learning? And how are we learning? And what are the experiences? What is that going to tell us about what we should do next? And so different from other initiatives, we've really dedicated a lot of time, a lot of expertise from the colleagues who are going to speak in a moment, to understanding the experiences of our colleagues honestly, the ones that we agree with, the ones that we didn't think were as comfortable for us to review, because this point which both Otto, Haliang, and Miriam are making is that this is a lived experience, and that experience is very divergent across the colleagues that are a part of the lab, 400 colleagues in all kinds of different development contexts. So we really wanted to have this team build a set of insights, identify a couple of leverage points, centers of gravity where we think the insights are really converging, help us understand where we need to move next with this collective work together. And just the last point that I would make here is that we did not in any way see that this learning initiative was a validation exercise. We were not trying to say, okay, good, we've done it, it's good, we learned 5 things and tick the box. To the contrary, we've tried to take an approach to learning that holds the complexity of what we're dealing with. It identifies divergence in views which we have not tried to resolve, just simply surface so that we can work together very, very honestly in the collective of the 187 colleagues who are joining us today to move this forward. So that really is our commitment. Nicole, Julia, Sudipti, and Lucas, let me hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Laurel, and welcome again to fellow UN colleagues, the broader systems practitioner colleagues, and also hopefully to the, I hope that the 187 of you on the call today are the curious minded, right? This is a lot about curiosity and learning, and that's why we took the initiative to do this learning accompaniment. So it's important to start kind of with a acknowledgement of we're in this moment of throwing around kind of these big buzzwords, as we like to do, like systems thinking and systems change and systems transformation. And in the next 15 minutes or so, we're hoping to sort of ground truth some of those big abstract ideas and narratives by sharing with you this learning accompaniment process that we ran to study systems leadership and transformation capabilities. As mentioned, we did use the Action Learning Lab as a site for observation and collection of experiential data specifically. And the learning team is here with us, as you'll see. These are our learning scientists, Julia, Lucas, and Sudipti. They're here to briefly explain kind of the methodology used, and then we're going to go into 3 kind of key takeaways. So I'm going to hand it off to Sudipti and then come back in and we'll go into the takeaways. Sudipti, do you want to walk us through the methodology?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So we took a design-led research approach to this work, which means we started with broad lines of inquiry based on what we know and what we assume to be true. From there, we collected both qualitative and some quantitative data using 4 tools. The first was a survey to develop a baseline understanding of practitioner experiences. Next, we did in-depth semi-structured interviews to get deep into the why and how of their experiences, particularly their emotions, perceptions, needs, and constraints. We also did ethnographic observation of the Action Learning Lab spaces, which included the workshops itself, the WhatsApp group, and the UN Digital Knowledge Platform, SparkBlue. And we conducted a focus group. We conducted an abductive sense-making process, which is known as design synthesis, to identify patterns and turn them to insights. And finally, we stress test all of our insights and organize into a narrative with supporting evidence. So I'll hand this back to the Nicole, Lucas, and Julia to talk about our leverage points.
Thanks, Sudipti. Lucas, do you want to start us off? We let's see. So let me first say, you should have all received a link with the slides in the chat. It's important that you have that because today we're just going to go through sort of a synthesis of the insights owing to kind of time constraints. But the slide deck itself has all 8 insights. So today, as Laurel mentioned, we're going to share sort of these 3 leverage points. And why are we calling them leverage points? These are really points of discovery that offer possibilities for future action. And that's what we wanted to do collectively today. So we'll describe some of the findings and also offer some questions to move us forward. Again, I invite you to really use the chat for this entire portion of today, for any questions, comments, reactions, sharing of resources, and so many of you on this call, you know, are really in this space and have so much knowledge to share. We want to connect this up with your knowledge and your resources. So really feel free to use the chat for all of that. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Lucas, and let's start talking about our first leverage point.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to everyone here. So to kick us off, the first leverage point we'd love to share with you, and I think that relates with many things shared before, and particularly by Miriam and others, is that systems transformations is both an expertise and a lived experience. So for those who perceive themselves to be experts, and that's the case of many practitioners we came across, they refer to literature, framework, theories, and so on. However, our research interestingly suggested that there is also a less visible component of systems practitioners who view the practice as something that they do that does not need to be explained because it's lived by them every day, is something that they do regularly. And in this way is considered to be sort of a common sense. And Nicole, I know you want to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes we share insights, or in this case, leverage points, and we don't ask, why do we care about this information? You know, why does this matter? So I think with each of these leverage points, we just want to very quickly kind of say, why do we care? Why should we care about the information that Lucas just told us? And just kind of unpack it a tiny bit. I think the starting point is really to say, you know, the theoretical aspects of systems change are largely agreed upon. That's what we found with the research respondents, right? That UN practitioners agree more or less that it's urgent and necessary to integrate across silos, to get to root causes, to consider relationality, and so on. They're largely in agreement with that theory. And so a lot of the theoretical frameworks do work for them. But I think the very interesting part of this sort of insight or set of insights really for this leverage point is that what we found is that many of our colleagues are saying this practice is not new, right? So what does that mean for us, right? Well, given that, I think we're asking really 2 questions going forward. One is, how might we actually empower, elevate, and make visible these existing systems practices that may be less visible to some? And perhaps that's why we're bringing in sort of expertise to talk about systems transformation. So how might we actually make those practices visible? And specifically, how might we together first ask our Global South and Black, Indigenous people of color colleagues who have expressed that these practices are common sense at times, how might we first ask them to unpack their own intuition and wisdom that they may not call systems transformation to shape to shape all of our actions in systems leadership and transformation.
So this leads us to the
Julia,
second.
please.
This leads us to the second leverage point, which is also mentioned briefly before: eagerness and permission to lead. And while UN practitioners seeking to upskill in systems leadership are eager and motivated to lead a change process, they often look to others to get permission or an invitation to do so. And what it means is that Action Learning Lab participants expressed a desire to lead a change, and hence also reason for joining the lab to learn the skills that will help them do this. However, many referred to various perceived barriers to leading, including the slow movement of the UN machine, the need of their boss to be in the room to get it, and even the fear to do things without permission.
Thanks, Julia. And so much of this one also, I think, does echo what Otto brought up in the framework, what Miriam was saying as well in her powerful points. One might kind of take this set of insights and this leverage point as kind of just an age-old dynamic in any bureaucracy, right? The willingness to change is there, but the structures and the culture are preventing change. What I want to bring our attention to, though, is saying, you know, it's worth really digging into a bit deeper into this notion of permissions and invitations and fears that was brought out through the research. So in this case, we might actually ask a couple of questions to move forward together. One of the questions is, how might we move away from what we're calling this, and what a colleague called the myth of neutrality in systems transformation? You know, and actually use an inequality and a structural racism lens to better understand how power moves through systems. So there was a feeling and a reflection from colleagues that there is often this myth of neutrality. And then secondly, how might we create the habits and postures that contribute to these cultures that provide what I'll call a permission by default, or a permission to lead by default? This brings about sort of concepts of building autonomous spaces and so on. So we might want to ask that question as well. Let's go ahead and move into our final leverage point. And this is about reflection, practical application, kind of this tension. So while some UN practitioners participating in the Action Learning Lab found the methods of listening and developing empathy, it really resonated with them. Many colleagues are, as was referred to earlier, and Miriam spoke to, they also remain deeply uncertain about practical application. So reflection and listening practices have helped some practitioners to really, we'll call it, cut out the noise. We found that a lot of the research respondents were saying they did identify their priorities and their goals better by going through this process. Others also, though, believe that the goal is to really act in complex systems, and what they're seeking is sort of bridges between awareness to action. So again, how do we care about this leverage point, and why does it matter to this community on this call? Well, you know, again, the research confirmed that there's some utility, very much so, in our beginning assumptions about inner transformation practice and the utility of it, like slowing down to reflect and listen. It also highlighted a need, however, to translate tools to contextual realities and connect up the theory of change of inner transformation to structural transformation. So again, this leads us to a few questions that hopefully we can take forward together. The first is, how might we identify entry points for slowing down and building humility into our practices? It's one thing for the listening practices to resonate. How do we find the entry points into our daily work for that? And then secondly, how might we determine who can build the bridges from learning spaces and sort of active systems interventions? Miriam mentioned earlier that it is the responsibility of UN colleagues, and so you know, I think we can go deeper on where that responsibility lies, how we can collaborate to sort of bridge, build those bridges. So again, just want to remind everybody to use, that was a lot of information. Please do continue using the chat to respond to some of these early findings. Also with any questions that you might have. We are continuing this process. We'll be working through the end of the month, actually continuing to collect data through a few participatory methods. And we'll be coming back to all of you with a workbook with sort of the detailed process and methodology, as well as the learning insights. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll hand it back to Laurel.
Nicole, thank you. And a special thanks really to Julia, to Sudipti, and to Lucas, who have spent a very intense few months working with us on this initiative. And to reiterate what Nicole has said, our intention here is to share this with you in a workbook. And in that workbook, you will see more of the details on the insights themselves, the leverage points which we described. And one of the things that we found quite useful, the team has been very, very careful to keep a running set of quotes and a direct articulation from the people who have been part of this Action Learning Lab experience, so that we don't lose that richness of precisely what it was that they had pointed to in terms of their experience. And that's something which will be really key to our design process for this initiative going forward. Thanks to all the comments in the chat, we will certainly keep this conversation going, and we will be sharing with all of you on this call and in this community the workbook as that is available in a couple of weeks' time. And this is a perfect segue to our colleague Karuna Kumar, who has been reviewing the insights, but more importantly has been part of the Action Learning Lab herself. So I want to give you an opportunity, Kumar, to Karuna, to reflect both on what you've heard today and the many reflections, and fundamentally your experience at both of the lab and how you see this work moving forward in the UN system. Karuna, over to you.
Thank you, Laurel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, depending on where you're joining in from. I've been given the very difficult task of sharing my experience in very vivid terms. So I will do my best to share my experiences of the Action Learning Lab, and as well as some insights that I drew personally from it. My name is Karuna Kumar. I work for the Bangkok Regional Hub. I sit within the SDG integration team, and the area of work that I look into, for the sake of semantics, is called future of work. But in its essence, it essentially talks about building resilience. It talks about ensuring employment for all that is decent and equitable. Now, during the, for my job, I constantly use the word resilience very often. I use labor market resilience very often. I use the term, how do we build resilience in governance? How do we build resilient systems? It is part of my everyday vocabulary. When I talk to governments, I talk to country office colleagues. It's a word that has stayed with me. But to talk of resilience and to experience resilience and to be resilient are very different things. So I really want to locate the experience of the Action Learning Lab in the context of what it was experienced in. The Action Learning Lab started, I remember very vividly, on 21st January 2021. That was the first session of the Action Learning Lab. This is when the first wave of the pandemic is just about coming to a close in some countries. The second wave is just about starting in the other countries. So there is an environment of absolute disruption. Some of us are grieving the loss of a few people. Some of us are preparing ourselves for a new wave, but also taking the time to take stock of what has happened and how do we sort of evolve with it. Now, during this period in time, the work of the UN has not stopped. It has only quadrupled, because it is our job, it is our moral responsibility, it is our professional responsibility to make sure that we do not stop serving the people that we've committed to and for which we are a part of the UN. And this brings us to a very difficult phase, because we are seeing this dissonance between our personal selves and our professional selves. And what I found the Action Learning Lab to be very unique is that it actually disintegrated every possible rule book that a traditional leadership summit or leadership training program actually provides you. I have spent many years in the private sector before I joined the UN. And so I have been part of many leadership summits, sessions, be it the private sector, a few in the development sector. And all of them profess that you must neatly put your life into two boxes. One is a personal and one is a professional. And these two boxes dare not interact with each other, because if they do, that is an hint of your unprofessionalism, and you have to try and maintain that arm's length distance between the two. So in every leadership summit, this is taught to us, that try and build about a balance and equilibrium. Now, what the Action Learning Lab does, it disintegrates that theory completely. It sort of says that you do not look for that sort of equilibrium. You look for integration. You have to integrate your personal and your professional. Now, this is something, it's easier said than done, because when you're sitting at your home and you're sort of hearing the arguments between children and parents, and you're trying to focus on your work, and you're trying to speak to government counterparts and talking about labor market resilience, but you're talking about distinctly different things in the same time paradigm, it makes it very difficult. And so I would say that in the first phase of the Action Learning Lab, you tend to resist it, you tend to avoid it, you tend to think that this is completely, they've completely lost it. What are they telling us to do? This is not possible. It is some sort of a fantastical sort of, framework. And so in the first phase of going through the Action Learning Lab, there is a very strong resistance to it. A lot of us resisted it. A lot of us felt that it does not relate to our work. Why are we focusing so much on the self? This shouldn't be something that is part of our jobs. And so in the first half of the session, many of us failed to see this instant gratification, which we usually do feel in leadership summits. You go to a summit, they validate who you are, they validate why you're doing what you're doing, and you come back feeling extremely happy that, well, you are all set to be the CEO the next year or in the coming years. Whereas this one breaks you down, and it says, well, break down, because you need to see who you are and why you're doing what you're doing before you actually go on and do it. So in my own personal experience, this is what transformation that we talk of. In very literal ways, transformation is a marked change in form, nature, and appearance. It's a metamorphosis that we're talking about. Now, no transformation or metamorphosis in this entire world or in the history of world politics has taken place purely in the external environment. It always starts internally, and then it presents itself externally. The leaders who brought about transformational change and changed the history of the world have done that only because they felt a personal calling towards it. It was not a professional agenda. And so, since we are sitting at a time where multilateralism is being questioned, where our organizations and the relevance of that organization to the people is being questioned, it's very important for us to sort of start that practice internally before we take it externally. So this was one of the experiences and insights that I gained in the first part of trying to find this sort of integration between the professional and the personal. And this is the term that the Action Learning Lab sort of alluded to, which is called the transformation literacy. which I think was a perfect term, because even to transform yourself, you need to be literate enough to understand what it takes to transform and to transform society in particular. I think brings me to the second point. The second point is this, that we have for too long tried to create this division between us and the people we serve. There is an us and there is a them. There is an us and then there is a beneficiary. There is an us and there is the people we serve. And so because of that distinction we draw, we tend to hold ourselves to a different standard as compared to the people we serve. And one of the very interesting things that the Action Learning Lab does is that it allows you to sink yourself into the character of the beneficiary. It is almost like a role play. It teaches you that you need to first understand before you serve the agenda of whether it's young people, whether it's women, whether it's girls, is that that agenda is deeply connected to you as a person. And there are many times when you do find a disconnect with this kind of a narrative, but I think it's very important to accept that sometimes you have to disconnect to reconnect. So this kind of a leadership teaching tells you to firstly disconnect with anything and everything that you've learned about leadership in any sort of playbook that you've been sort of exposed to. And in that role playing, for me, I'm somebody who's been extremely passionate about the agenda of women, of supporting young girls. I've been working on this agenda for the longest time. But for the first time, when I went through the Action Learning Lab, I felt a deep personal connect. I felt the personal connect in my life as a daughter and as a partner. How was I able to make sure that I have room for my own personal growth whilst I am involved in all the household chores that I'm expected to do? How do I ensure that from an employment perspective, I am trying to make sure that I am working at full capacity and as productive as I could possibly be, whilst there are many other responsibilities on me. And so there was an empathy developed from a personal perspective, from a perspective of that woman that I'm trying to serve and the girls that I'm trying to serve are very much a part of me. And we have this shared challenge to rise above everything that we are going through. And so I think even though there was a very awkward integration of this personal and professional, and I say awkward because most leadership trainings do not emphasize on this enough. You talk about a balance and equilibrium, but you do not talk about an integration, which I think was very important for me to take away. And I think the final point that I do want to sort of emphasize is that all of us are very different people coming out of the pandemic as compared to the people who entered the pandemic. We are all different people today. We've all evolved as becoming better versions of ourselves. We've become more connected, more grounded, more resolute. And I think that this kind of an Action Learning Lab will only gain greater appreciation in a post-COVID environment, if I can use the word post-COVID. But it has only sort of, ascertained the need to see leadership from a more human construct. We've spent too much time sort of developing these words, which are very large, opaque words, and we tend to feel alienated for them. There is no human connection to these words. So in the end, I would say that, well, I can't speak of leadership. Leadership is a very personal sort of understanding. It's a very personal value system. But I can speak of resilience because today when I speak of resilience with colleagues, when I speak of resilience with governments, when I speak of resilience with young people, women, girls, you're not only speaking that word in semantics, you feel it, you've experienced it, you know what it takes to be resilient. And so for me, I think this was the Action Learning Lab personally played a very key role in helping me transform into the person I've always wanted to become a far more resilient woman, to be able to sort of find a greater determination, a finer persistence. And it allowed me to do that. And if I was to become a sort of effective leader tomorrow, I think it is the resilience that will count than anything else. So I think that is my personal takeaway. But I will say that the Action Learning Lab is not an instant gratification process. You have to force yourself to stay with it. There are many times when I felt, okay, I think maybe let's just part ways. It doesn't seem to be, this connection between personal and professional doesn't seem to be really working. But if you stick with it, if you just go with the flow, if you just have faith and trust the process, you will come out to be a slightly stronger, determined, and resilient version of yourself. And I think that's all that matters when you want to be an effective leader, to be able to sort of bring change and transform societies. I think it takes resilience more than anything else. Thank you.
Karuna, thank you so much. Very powerful. And thank you for sharing so honestly and genuinely your experience. And I think you've really put a tremendous amount of context and insight for all of those in the room in terms of this connection between self, between the personal and your professional, and this point that both Miriam and Otto have referred to in different ways, which is our agency. And as Otto had said earlier, not looking somewhere else for something to change, but starting with ourselves. You've also reminded me, we have a colleague of ours is on the call as well, who once sent me a little visual which said, if you aren't confused, you really don't understand the context. And I think what you're describing is something very similar. There are high levels of uncertainty. It does create a level of discomfort. There's not knowing. We can't tell you 5 things, you do them tomorrow, we've got it. It's a lived experience, and it's one that requires an ability to withstand, as you've said, some real questions of yourself, some real questions of, is this really something that's going to, and then an ability to move through towards ultimately what we know. If we don't experience those moments of tension and discomfort and so on, a transformation is not possible. We are doing what we have often done in the past, and that is not the way that we want to recover from COVID and the decade of action. So Karuna, thank you so much. I know that we are at the end of our time. All the same, Haliang, I would like to give you maybe just a minute and a half, if you would, Haliang, to come in with reflections on what you've heard and what you think is important from this in terms of how we take the work forward with the UN system. Haliang, thank you again.
No, thank you. And I think it's really a fascinating discussion. And to what Karuna just said, I think the key takeaway I have is that you need to have an open mind. You need to keep an open mind to ideas that are perhaps unfamiliar and that are, initially not convincing, but still keep an open mind to see, to explore. I think this is what I try to do all the time, frankly. So I think it's really great to hear from Karuna's experience. And in terms of a question, I think that James, Dixon asked in the Q&A, I see a couple of colleagues have answered. I think the key question here is that, the leadership of the organization also needs to learn and to, try to, take risks and decisions that are perhaps unorthodox, untraditional in their organizational culture, and be the leader, and in taking risks and really just try to push, new ways of doing business. I think everyone in the organization has to recognize that business as usual is simply not working. So, and we needed to work at different levels to build that level of confidence and the competency to, seek the changes we want. So I will stop here. There's so much details that we can get into, so there's no time. So thank you very much, everyone, for this sharing and learning.
Haliang, thank you. And thank you for your leadership in this space and across all of the work that UNDP is taking forward on innovation, on systems transformation, and certainly your leadership through the next strategic plan period will be really valuable. So thank you again for being here. Colleagues, many of you have shared LinkedIn details and resources and other things. Let me put 2 additional suggestions on the table for you. Number 1, on Spark Blue, and Nadine, maybe you can put the link in the chat for colleagues. We have a transformation space. All of the recordings of our previous dialogues, not the Action Learning Lab, that is a protected space for the participants, but from the global dialogues and different resources are available. We use that mailing list often to connect and communicate new ideas and offerings with with the community. So if you haven't already and you're curious, you can take a look there, but you can also register for that space and you'll get details going forward. One of the things that we will follow up with this group, but all of those who are part of these communities, sparkblue.org transformation and the Action Learning Lab, is this workbook. So give us a couple of weeks. If we said this will be brought together, you start to see the shape of the insights through the presentation, which has been made available, and more of that is coming next. I want to end really by thanking Otto and his team who have led this Action Learning Lab over the past couple of months, and all of the participants from the lab who are on the call today as well too. This was an experiment. We had a sense of where we wanted to go, and it moved and changed as we got there. So it was an open mind, Hal Young, as you said. It was a really high degree of flexibility. It was a tremendous amount of listening, and certainly a tremendous amount of humility to be able to shift and understand and change as we go. And so I want to recognize Otto, but also his team, Antoinette, Dorian, Kelvy, and Emma, who are all also on the call this morning. We couldn't have done this without you, and we couldn't have done this without this community. So I really want to thank everyone for their time this morning. This will be as strong and as powerful as we make it. So please let us stay connected. You'll hear more from us, and we'll continue. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laurel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye, Otto.
Thank you,
Bye,
Miriam.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Otto.
Thanks, Laurel.
Everybody.
Thank you, Miriam.